Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 36. I'd like to focus on two ideas in this section, the promise of God and the mystery of God. And this section tells us something about God's character and nature. Again, the issue that haunts Paul. The Jews are for the most part not following Christ as the Messiah. But Paul says eventually they will all be saved. He writes, when the full number of Gentiles has come in, all Israel will be saved. Why will they be saved? They've rejected Jesus over and over again. It doesn't seem to be any evidence that they ever will turn around. Paul is referring to the promises made to the Jews in Jeremiah and Isaiah. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Paul goes on to say the Jews are, quote, loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. God keeps his promises. I like the term irrevocable. God's gifts and call are irrevocable. He cannot go back. He cannot break his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the rest. He told them that they would be a great nation, a kingdom of priests, that they would be the means by which God would save the world. He would be their God, and they would be his people, and he makes a promise to them that he will hold them. That was a promise. It looks grim right now. The Jews have turned away. But God plays a long game. Decades, centuries, millennia. God will keep his promise. This is a promise Paul holds on to. God is not a liar. He can't change his mind on these things. Let's think about this now. The Jews were enslaved in Egypt for roughly about 200 years. And all that time, they prayed and begged God for freedom. For 200 years. Some lived, some died before they ever saw salvation. And eventually, God sent Moses. And it took 200 years. God kept his promise. There was a Babylonian captivity that lasted for about 60 years. Eventually, they were freed. 60 years is a long time. Abram, later called Abraham, was first called by God when he was 75 years old. And God told Abram that he would become the father of a great nation. Abraham and Sarah were infertile, no kids, but God told them that they would be a great nation. Then God appears to Abraham again at the age of 99. Isaac is born to Abraham when he's 100. That was a 25-year wait. God makes a promise to Abraham when he's 75, and he fulfills that promise in part 25 years later. 200 years, 60 years, 25 years. God may not fulfill his promises in 10 minutes like we want it, even a day like we prefer, a week maybe. Oh, that's a long time. But he does eventually fulfill his promises. He always will. We just don't know when. Why? Because God is God, and that's what God does. It's his very nature to be faithful to his promises. We wait for God. We're not Abraham. We're not the Jews. So we need to be careful about what we think God has promised us. But we can be sure of this in our lives. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purposes. That's what God promised us in Romans earlier. This does not mean we get our dream job, for example, or that the relationship that we want works out, that you get the person, the man and woman of your dreams. There will be heartbreak, there'll be disappointment in our lives, but the promise is that all things work for the good, that good in the future. And we don't see it yet, but God will never forget you because God never breaks his promises. But how does my life make any sense? You know, there are times when I feel like my life's just a mess. There are times when you feel like things are just chaotic and nothing is going your direction. You try to trust, but your life just seems crazy and all the evidence is pointing the opposite direction, that God loves you or God cares for you or God remembers who you are. And it just doesn't look like God is keeping his promises. And at that moment, read the doxology at the end of the passage. Basically, the message is this: you don't understand God. We can't. We don't get God. We don't tell God how to make sense. He tells us how he makes sense, and we'll never fully understand it. A God that can be comprehended and understood by our minds is not a God worth worshiping. It may be frustrating that God is mysterious, but God by nature must be mysterious and beyond our comprehension.